Hello, this is part number 64, preparation for NSE4 exam, Fortinet. Let's start our fourth part of infrastructure, Fortinet, firewall authentication. What does include firewall authentication? It includes authentication of users and user groups. Firewall authentication is more reliable than just IP addresses and device type authentication. Users must authenticate by entering valid credentials. Traditional firewalling grants network access by verifying the source IP address and the device. This is an inadequate and can pose a security risk because the firewall cannot determine who is using the device to which is granting access. FortiGate includes authentication of users and users groups, and as a result, we can follow individuals across multiple devices. Where access is controlled by a user or user group, users must authenticate by entering valid credentials, such as username and the password. And after FortiGate validates the user, FortiGate applies firewall policies and profiles to allow or to deny access to specific network resources. FortiGate methods of firewall authentication. FortiGate supports multiple methods of firewall authentication, such as local password authentication, server-based password authentication, and two-factor authentication. Local password authentication includes username and password stored on FortiGate itself. Server-based password authentication, also called remote password authentication, password is stored on POP3, Radius, LDAP, lightweight directory access protocol servers, or TACACS plus servers. Two-factor authentication is enabled on top of existing method and requires you to know something you have, such as a token or a certificate. This is a system authentication that is enabled on top of existing method. It cannot be enabled without first configuring one of the other methods. It requires something you know, such as a password, and something you have, token or certificate. During this session, we will learn about these methods. So let's start with local password authentication. It is the simplest method of authentication. Local password authentication is when user account information, username, and the password is stored locally on the FortiGate device. This method works well for a single FortiGate installation. Local accounts are created on the user definition page. User definition you can find if you go to graphical user interface, go to user and authentication, and then go to user definition. There you can go with the pathway user type, login credentials, certificate, and extra information. There is a wizard that takes you through this process. For local password authentication, select local user as the user type and create a username and a password. If desired, you can also add email and SMS information to the account. Enable two-factor authentication and add the user to the pre-configured user group. After we create the user, then we can add the user or any pre-configured user group to which the user is a member to the firewall policy, and in order to authenticate, you can add it to the user group. You will learn about the second type of server-based authentication now. The server-based password authentication, or another name remote authentication, is when remote authentication server authenticate users. This method is desirable when multiple FortiGate devices need to authenticate the same users or user groups, or when adding FortiGate to a network that already contains the authentication server. When we use a remote authentication server to authenticate the users, FortiGate sends the user's entered credentials to the remote authentication server. Then the remote authentication server responds by indicating whether the credentials are valid or not. If the entered credentials are valid, FortiGate consults its configuration to deal with the traffic. Note that it is the remote authentication server, not FortiGate, that evaluates the user credentials. When a server-based password authentication method is used, or in case some configurations of the user information locally. So the process is first, FortiGate sends authentication required message to the user. Then user enters his or her username and the password. Then FortiGate sends that username and the password, those credentials, to the remote server. Remote server accepts or denies this and sends this information to FortiGate. And then FortiGate makes a decision to accept or to deny this user. Remote authentication servers. FortiGate provides support for many remote authentication servers, including POP3, Radius, LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol servers, and TACACS Plus servers. The only type of the server that requires an email address as the login credential is POP3 server. All other remote authentication servers use the username. Some POP3 servers require the full email with the domain, such as user@example.com. Others require the suffix only, while still others accept both formats. This requirement is determined by the configuration of the server and is not a setting on FortiGate. We can configure POP3 authentication only through the command line interface. No graphical user interface configuration for POP3 servers. Note that we can also configure LDAP to validate with email rather than with username. Server-based password authentication. Users. We can configure FortiGate to use external authentication servers in the following two ways. First way, create user accounts on FortiGate. Select remote user type and point to pre-configured remote server and add user to the group. With this method, we select the remote authentication server type, such as Radius, TechX Plus, or LDAP server, then point FortiGate to our pre-configured remote authentication server, then add the user to an appropriate group. This is usually done when we want to add two-factor authentication to our remote users. Remember that POP3 server is only configurable through command line interface. Second way to configure remote external authentication server is to add the remote authentication server to user groups. With this method, we must create a user group and add the pre-configured remote server to the group. And accordingly, any user who has an account on the remote authentication server can authenticate. If we are using other types of remote servers, such as LDAP server as the remote authentication server, we can control access to specific LDAP groups as defined on the LDAP server. Similar to local password authentication, we must then add the pre-configured user group in which the user is a member to a firewall policy in order to authenticate. LDAP overview. What is LDAP? LDAP is a lightweight directory access protocol. It is an application protocol for accessing and maintaining distributed directory information services. The LDAP protocol is used to maintain authentication, data that may include departments, people and groups of people, passwords, email addresses, and printers. LDAP consists of a data representation scheme, a set of defined operations, and the request and response network. The LDAP protocol includes a number of operations that a client can request, such as search, compare, and add or delete an entry. Binding this operation in which the LDAP server authenticates the user is successfully authenticated. If user authenticated successfully, then binding allows the user access to the LDAP server based on that user's permissions. Configuring LDAP server on FortiGate. On the LDAP servers page, which you can find if you go to Graphical User Interface, Users and Authentication, we go to LDAP servers. There we can configure FortiGate to point to an LDAP server for server-based password authentication. The configuration depends heavily on the server schema and security settings. Windows Active Directory AD is very common. The common name identifier setting is the attribute name we use to find the username. Some schemas allow us to use the attribute user ID. Active Directory most commonly uses SAM account name or CN. CN stands for common name, but can use other parameters as well. So common name identifier directory tree attribute that identifies users. Distinguished name is a part of hierarchy where the user record exists. Username and password, they are credentials for the LDAP administrator. Distinguished name setting identifies the top of the tree where the users are located, which is generally the DC value. However, it can be a specific container or organizational unit, OU. We must use the correct X.500 or LDAP format. The bind type consists of setting depends on security settings of the LDAP server. Bind types available like simple, anonymous, and regular. We must use the setting regular to specify a regular bind. If we are searching across multiple domains and require the credentials of a user that is authorized to perform LDAP queries, for example, an LDAP administrator. If we want to have a secure connection between FortiGate and the remote LDAP server, then enable secure connection. There is a toggle. You can disable or enable it. And include the LDAP server protocol, LDAPs or Start TLS, as well as the Certificate Authority, CA certificate that verifies the server certificate. LDAPs uses port 636 for communication. The Test Connectivity button tests only whether the connection to the LDAP server is successful or not. To test whether a user's credentials can successfully authenticate, we must use the Test User Credentials button or use command line interface. Thank you.